also want to introduce our speaker today, which is going to be Michelle Phoenix. Michelle Phoenix grew up in France. Her mom is American and her dad's Canadian. She pretty much has been working with TCKs and MKs and really focusing on really pouring out her ministry with investing in them. She just has such a heart for really seeing that these people groups are really known and identified, and she's really focused on kind of building her life into being able to see that these TCKs, the issues that they're going through, the situation that they deal with is something that's known. She has a wealth of knowledge about kind of the things that they deal with, kind of the situations, and some resources, some tips to kind of pretty much address some of the struggles that TCKs, MKs deal with as they move back or transition back to the States. Without further ado, let me go ahead and just turn it over to Michelle. Michelle can go ahead and just say hello to the audience.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for having me today. So as it has been said, my name is Michelle, and most of my biography you now know. I was born and raised in France. My brother was born there and raised there as well. He was just 18 months older than me. I came from a multicultural home in the sense that my dad was Canadian, my mom is American, and after Bible school at Moody Bible Institute, they decided to go to France as missionaries in the area of music and worship, and they were there for 37 years. So I got to be born there and to grow up there. And many of my earliest memories revolve around pastries because it was France after all, and revolve around the French school system, which for me was not a really good fit. I was a very sensitive, fragile child, and the French school system, at least in that place where I was living, was not built for me. So I grew up in a castle just north of Paris in a little town called La Morlaix. The Bible school where my parents taught was housed in this beautiful, I think it's an 18th century castle. So the flip side of being that sensitive, fragile little girl was that I was also a very creative and imaginative little girl. So getting to grow up in the halls and on the grounds of a castle was really special to me. I went through the French school system until 9th grade. In 9th grade, I moved to the Black Forest Academy in Germany, and I spent my high school years there from 9th to 12th grade. My first year was as a boarding student. And again, the way I am made up, the way God made me unfit for being a boarding student and being far from home. It just wasn't a good fit for me. The loneliness, the feeling of isolation, the missing a sense of home was really big. So after that first year, my parents moved out to Alsace, which is right across the border from Germany, and got a house there that was built in 1780, an old farmhouse. And we commuted every day from my 10th through 12th grade years from France to Germany, and they worked at Black Forest Academy, BFA, and I was able to live at home and finish my studies there. And I know it's during those years at BFA that I began to understand, and this was, I think, right around the time that the term TCK was coined. So we really didn't have a word for it before then, but I began to understand the uniqueness that comes along with growing up cross-culturally in ministry. And for the first time in my life, I started to look around and realize that other people, even though their cultures might have been different than mine, had similar traits that they had derived from growing up as I did, straddling worlds. And that really started me down this road of kind of inquiry into what a TCK is. And as I got older, I went off to college. I went to Wheaton College in Illinois, which is about 5 minutes down the road from where I'm currently sitting. Never thought I'd come back here. College was hard for me. It is so good for other people. For me, it was hard because I came into that transition, and I'm so glad we're going to talk about transitions. I came into the transition with really a huge chip on my shoulder. I came into not just the transition, but into North America with these pre-existing notions in my mind that were based on nothing but hearsay, but that I counted on as the basis for the way that I was going to integrate or not into this culture. So Wheaton for 3.5 years, got out as fast as I could, worked for a year as a screenwriter. There's a whole story there, writing discussion starters for youth groups, youth discussion groups in the format of a Ferris Bueller's Day Off movie. So fun times, not a whole lot of pay. And then the company that had hired me ran out of money, so I was without a job. At that point, I went back to France to visit my parents, met with my former principal from Black Forest Academy, and he said, "Hey, how about you come back and work in the communications department at BFA?" To which I said, "Okay, but do I have to raise support?" And he said, "Yes, you do have to raise support." So did that and arrived at BFA on November 2nd, 1991, which is almost exactly 30 years ago. Ended up teaching there for 20 years in the areas of music and theater, and English and creative writing, all the fun stuff. And during those 20 years, working both in the dorms and at school, I was able to dig a little deeper into what it is to be a TCK, what the needs are, what the prep work needs to be, what I didn't have before my transition that I want to offer MKs today. After 20 years, after being diagnosed with cancer, after wondering how many years I had left on this earth, I decided, and God kind of imposed this on me, but I embraced it eventually, that I needed to figure out how I was going to make however many remaining years I had, make them count. So I left BFA. I launched a broader ministry to MKs globally, to missionaries' families globally. Moved back to Wheaton, which in itself is ironic. And found a home here. And for 10 years, nearly 11 years now, I have been doing this more global ministry that really is focused on educating people about who MKs are, what makes them tick, what their skills are, what their challenges are, and what their victories can be. And it's educating not just the parents of MKs, it's mission organizations, it's aid organizations, it's MKs themselves about who they are, because a lot of times we haven't had that kind of self-exploration happen in our own lives. And so this, what I'm doing right now, is part of the many facets of this ministry.
Wow, sounds so exciting. So excited for this next segment. Before we get into that, let me go ahead and turn it to Ronnie to kind of discuss about some of the things and some of the ministries that he has to provide with Compass.
Yeah, so just a quick blurb here. As you've heard Michelle's story, I'm actually blown away with your story. Very inspiring, and I mean that. She is going to be our plenary speaker for our upcoming Southeast 8th annual Southeast MK retreat, which is happening in Waverly, Florida, in Honey Creek Retreat Center. So that's from February 18th to the 20th. For more information, just go to our website, www.compass-ministries.net. So www.compass-ministries, .net. I keep confusing it with .org. So it's going to be from February 18th to the 25th. Right now, up to December 30th, there is a early bird special. It normally costs $110 for the whole weekend, which is still low. And that is because of so many sponsors, so many donors that want MKs to receive from Michelle Phoenix and also from other speakers and workshop speakers. So take advantage of this now, because it's $110 from January on, and it's only $75 for every individual that signs up, and $65 for a group of 10. Minimum 10 people, you can get it for $65 if you sign up, a group of 10. So do it now, because after December 31st, I'm sorry, January 1st, it's going to be $110, which is still low. It is still low, because we want every college age MKs and post-college MKs to come and be part of this. For those of you who are post-college from 20 something to 60 years old and wants to be here too, we have a post-college track, and there are rooms for you all. Obviously, it's going to be a higher price, but go to the website. And for married people, we have lodging also, and they're a little bit going to be a higher price for that. But you don't miss it. All right, back to you, Chandler.
Thanks so much, Ronnie. Appreciate it. All right. So let me go ahead and get right into this. Really, Michelle, I had a question about when we are talking about transitions and the TCK transition and MKs. What exactly does that entail?
Well, that little nugget, that's a huge topic. In my understanding, in the teaching that I do on transition, it actually entails 3 phases. There's the before phase, preparing to leave, the arriving phase, trying to find your bearings in a new place, and then the putting down roots phase. And each one of those have a different strategy or multiple strategies that can be used to do them well. When I speak to adult MKs, even those who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, who can still come to the retreat in February, when I speak with them and I ask them what the hardest transition of their lives has been, most of them will say that it was the transition from overseas to their passport culture, if that's what they did, if that was their track after high school, to go back to their passport culture for higher education. So that, I think, is the transition that I focus on the most in my teaching, but the steps that we can take, the mitigating tools that we have would be applicable to any kind of huge transition. And it's important to note that MKs just approach the topic of transition more intensely than a lot of people would, because we often carry the accumulated weight of multiple transitions with us. So the average, say, North American person or monocultural person will not have a huge number of major moves in their life, but the TCK person, so TCK is a term that encompasses missionaries' kids and diplomats' kids and military kids, anybody who has spent a significant number of their formative years in a culture other than their passport culture. And the average TCK will have 8 major moves by the age of 18. So we come to transition carrying whatever that emotional weight is that we've accumulated over those multiple moves. And it's important to know also that in the life of a TCK, the move isn't often just across town or within a country. A lot of times we're moving from one universe to another, from one cultural context to a completely different cultural context, in obvious and less obvious ways. And so that intensifies the experience of transition for a lot of the MKs that I work with. So in my era, so I graduated from high school in 1986. I know that makes me ancient, but in my era, there wasn't a whole lot of training on this topic. The preparation I got seemed to be intended to kind of make me nervous about the transition. I heard a lot of "you'll never fit in and nobody will ever understand you." And I was never told that by virtue of being a TCK, by virtue of having done transition before and witnessed others doing transition, I actually had a special skill set that I could use in transitioning back to my passport culture. One of the challenges is that often for MKs, we don't look positively on our passport culture. There are some aspects of it that we might like, but a lot of times we bring just a reluctance, if not worse, into the transition back to our passport culture. So for us to know that we have the skill to apply to our transition is great, but a lot of us, myself, especially in my transition years, a lot of us just don't want to apply that skill set because we don't really want to integrate. We don't really want to adapt to this culture that we often have looked down on for many of our years overseas. So that's part of the preparation phase that needs to happen within MK families, within MK schools, within MK communities, to stop bashing the passport culture kind of our national sport, and to apply to our passport culture the same kind of understanding and inquisitiveness and willingness that we would to a completely foreign culture that we were being brought to for education.
So I like that talk where you're discussing about the preparation.
Yeah.
Preparation is, you mentioned that preparation is being able to have a good mindset about your passport country. And so that's for the preparation and making sure that these TCK MKs that are moving back, that they're properly equipped to kind of handle, or they're going in with the right mindset.
Yeah.
So what are some proper mindsets, or some ways that TCKs, especially for their parents, as they're getting ready to like move back for college or move back over to the home country, what are ways that parents can properly prep their kids, not just with mindset? What are some like specific steps?
Yeah. I mean, so much there. The internet has made things so much easier. And I think we forget what a tool it is for us in huge transitions. So I would recommend for parents, number one, that they do an actual physical trip to the college or the university or the workplace that their children are going to go to. Even a college tour of picking a place is so much easier when you can be on the campus and meet some of the students at that school. In my day, the reason that I picked Wheaton College is that there were actually, this was pre-internet, there were actually 2 college catalogs in the library at BFA, and one of them was Moody and one of them was Wheaton, and Wheaton had the prettier picture on the cover. So that's the only reason that I chose to go to Wheaton. So when I landed there, I had no understanding of even the location. I didn't know, okay, I'm going to show my stupidity. I didn't know that there was a huge lake, the Lake Michigan, right next to Chicago. I thought that was the ocean. My geography of the United States was completely off. And I had never set foot there. So I hadn't had any exposure to college culture, which is so different from MK school, even senior year culture. There's just something so totally different about it. So I do encourage parents as they can to have that in-person physical meet with the college campus and some people at the campus as well, if they can. And if not, when they're doing their research online, to really look into not only the institution, the school that the kids are going to, but to look at the values of the school, to look at proximity to things that will be helpful in dealing with feeling uprooted. So when I moved back this time, the first thing I discovered is that a French restaurant had sprung up downtown Wheaton in the years that I'd been gone. And for me, that was important to know that if there was a day when I was really feeling down, when I was really feeling disconnected from my other world, there was that place that I could go. I also discovered there was a group of people who get together once a month to speak French over lunch. And that was really helpful for me too. So not just to look at the qualifications of the school for the studies that the MK wants to do, but also to look at the broader context of, is this a place where this MK would feel comfortable? For instance, without wanting to bash any college, if an MK comes from a city, comes from Singapore, comes from a place that is bustling and always alive, they might not do well at a place like Taylor University, which is out in the middle of cornfields and not a whole lot of options for that bustling energy that MK is used to. If an MK comes from a small village like I did, a small village in France, small village in Germany, they would do better in a place like Taylor than the other MKs would. I think one of the most, not the most, but one of the most important factors in transitioning well for this big transition is actually grieving well. And we don't talk about grief enough. A lot of times the adults in missionary communities try to protect the MKs by hiding their grief or by managing it really tightly, by holding on to those reins really tightly. And so MKs in their lifetime of transitions, and each transition is loss, which means that each transition is grief. In their lifetime of transitions, a lot of times we have not been given permission to grieve or shown how to grieve in a healthy way. So there's an accumulated effect of grief in a lot of MKs. We accumulate and we relive the griefs that we've experienced. And this transition from overseas back to passport culture is so huge, not just on the grief side, but even on the cultural trauma side of not having our place, not being known, having to reintroduce ourselves to a whole new world. It's so big that if we haven't learned prior to that transition how to number one, feel and then show and process grief, we're going to struggle more than MKs who have. So a lot of the speaking I do, both to missionary groups and to parents of MKs and to MKs themselves, is to teach us that number one, grief is not weakness. Grief is honest response. Jesus wept. Jesus wept when he knew that Lazarus is going to be alive again minutes later. He showed us that grief is important, and then knowing how to live well in a season of grief. Because a lot of the self-help books that we're going to see, even those directed directly at MKs, a lot of those books are going to tell you how to get over grief. And my experience is that grief is a companion that's going to stay with us for a while. One of the articles I've written that is the most distributed and the most read is How to Live Well, 9 Steps to Living Well in a Season of Grief. So how do we do transition, feeling, acknowledging the losses, and carving out the energy and the headspace to be able to engage in a new place when we arrive there. So grief ceremonies of some sort in families are important. Finding a family way of every time a good friend leaves, every time a grandparent passes away, if that's the case, every time you move from one place to another, having this ritual that the family does to mark that moment is really important. So MKs have that ritual to emphasize in their minds that, yes, this is an ending. And then for parents to be able to model healthy grief, overt grief. And parents of MKs, unless they're MKs themselves, parents of MKs are never going to fully understand what it feels like to grieve as an MK. We have attached to these places that have shaped us in a different way than monocultural people who moved there in their adult years attached to those places. So there's a degree of pain to transition that parents won't fully comprehend, but they can learn how to help their MKs to walk through that grief, to find the beauty in the grief, because the grief is the measure of our love. So the more we grieve, the more we've loved, to honor the love, and then to explore the grief and find ways to live in it during this long season when it becomes our companion.
So pretty much grieving is a process of really being, if I've got it correctly, is being honest with kind of your emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say what happens at times when MKs transition back to the States is they kind of adopt a very like a numb, apathetic feeling because it's so overwhelming?
Yeah. Yes. And the problem is that numbness is a surface lid that we put on the grief. It doesn't keep the grief from moving and growing and festering in some cases, but it gives us the illusion that life is manageable. But it's so unhealthy. And part of this comes from, you mentioned emotions in a broader sense. All emotions are suspect to a lot of MKs because we live under what I call the mountain of shoulds, the shoulds that are imposed on us, either really imposed on us or we think they're being imposed on us. Sometimes they're of our own making. The shoulds that say you should be strong, you should never be sad, you should never be angry, you should never be rebellious, you should never resent a move or a transition. All of these shoulds pile up in our minds to the point where we put that lid on and screw it down tight and feel like any emotion is a weakness and any emotion is disloyalty to the call of our parents to be missionaries. So being able, and I speak to parents all the time who have young children, when they're young is the age when we can show them and give them permission to have these emotions, which are absolutely normal in the high stress, high movement life of children and teenagers growing up between worlds.
So that's one thing the parents, what can like the TCK, MK individual, like say for instance, we got a scenario where there's like an 18-year-old TCK getting ready to move back for college.
Mm-hmm.
They're sent by themselves.
Yes.
So pretty much now they're exposed to a whole new culture.
Yes.
And it's overwhelming for them.
Yes.
We talk about the emotions, we talk about being in a sense vulnerable and giving that time to grieve. How can a TCK, when they're on their own, how can they properly, what are some techniques or some strategies or some things they can do to properly grieve on their own? What are some things that you would recommend that you've seen work, that you've recommended for practice, that if they're feeling overwhelmed or they're feeling they're missing back home from where they came from, how can they go about that?
Yeah. That is so hard. And I wish I could pull up my article with the 9 steps in it. I'm just going to give you a couple that come to mind. But what you said initially about a 17-year-old going back alone to the States or to whatever the passport culture is, that's becoming less common, but it's still far too common. I really encourage any parents who might be listening to this to make a way, start raising funds 5 years before your kids graduate from high school if you need to, but find a way to be there for this transition. And if not to be on campus, if that's where your kids are going with them, you don't want mom and dad trailing after you around to class to class when you're on campus during your first couple of weeks, but just being within driving distance during the first couple of weeks of college, even month of college. Even if the MK doesn't realize how comforting it is, I can guarantee you that it is comforting to have mom and dad within reach in case of emergency during those initial weeks of this new life in a new place. So some things that MKs can do to help them to live well in a season of grief. Number one, they need to find somebody to speak with about their grief. Initially, that might be people that you've left, that you've just said goodbye to, because they're in the same situation as you are at that point. They'll understand it. The danger of that is if it's only people that you've left in your past, you're not going to put down roots in your current location. And that's important too. So I would encourage both of those, to be able to reminisce with people you love and to find people in your new location. And this might take a while because North Americans especially do relationships differently than MKs do. So it takes a while to figure out what makes a person tick here. Whereas in an MK community, we would know within an hour who they are. So giving it time, but looking for that person who will have the empathy and at least some understanding of multicultural ministry, that they will listen with that amount of knowledge. I've got to say that one of the things I do in the summer times is I do 2 reentry retreats for Canadian MKs in Canada, the Reboot reentry retreats under the More Network. And it is something that if somebody had told me before I graduated that you need to go do an MK retreat in the States and you need to, get close to a bunch of people while you're grieving and then say goodbye to them again a week later, I would have, stomped my foot and said, absolutely not. This is the only time that I tell parents that it's okay to force your kids to do reentry, because my experience is within an hour or two of being there, they're so grateful that they have this experience to be with others that they might not have known the day before, but others who are in the same phase of life, who are facing the same fears, the same losses, the same discombobulation, to use a big word, of not knowing what the heck is going on in their lives. And to come to a retreat like that, where they are given the chance to process their grief, the chance to connect in a meaningful way, the chance to find God in the middle of the transition, and the chance to learn the culturally appropriate skills that are going to be required for this new insertion into a new society. I can't overstate how important these reentry retreats are. Barnabas does them, the Naramore Foundation does them, Interaction International, so many great options. It is worth every penny of maybe fundraised money to get MKs to be able to do this. So back to some of what can help during that period of transition. Finding temporary ways of relieving the grief is important. I say temporary because it's easy to get lost in video games and never surface again for weeks at a time. So whether it's video games or watching a movie or playing ping pong or just whatever it is that is helpful for a moment to relieve some of that grief is something that can almost be put into your weekly schedule, because that's good for you. The other thing that I recommend is, instead of putting a lid on the grief in order to be able to function, to put, and this is imagery, but I think you'll follow, to imagine putting the grief in a jar, in a transparent jar. We put it on a shelf that is within eyesight. The lid is not screwed on. The lid is just a little off kilter on top. And we know the grief is there. We're not ignoring the fact that it's there. We're not denying it. We have it there, and we go back to it intentionally with the people we're talking with our own journaling, whatever it might be. We pay attention to the grief, but while it's on that shelf, we can focus our minds on the classes, on the events on campus, on whatever it is that we need to enter into as well in order to be able to put down roots in a new place. So having that grief accessible at all times, but not having it right in front of us, the central focus of our attention at all times, is helpful as well. Counseling, really great. I think allowing an outpouring of grief in whatever the way that is. So if it's music for you, listen to that music, go off into a field where you can be by yourself and let the music wash over you. If it's art, if it's journaling, finding a way to relieve some of that kind of pressure cooker buildup of emotion is really helpful too. There's lots more in that article. The article, by the way, all of my most read articles are also in audio form now. My podcast is Pondering Purple. It's on all of the podcast platforms out there, but the 9 Ways to Live Well in a Season of Grief is one of the podcast episodes that can be listened to as well. And it can be read on my website, michellephoenix.com.
Nice. That's a lot of helpful tip. I like the other aspect when you talked about like a transparent jar that like the lid's just like it's open, but it's just a little open.
Yeah.
Giving it that time where you can address it when
Yeah.
it needs to be addressed, but at the same time you're able to prioritize on things that need to be prioritizing. You got to do your shopping. You got to do your studying. You
Yeah.
got to do things that's right in front of you.
Yeah.
But when you have the time, you also have that time to again address the grief,
Yeah.
address the situations, right? Because if
Yes.
what could potentially happen if the grief is not addressed? What have you seen, or what are some stories or situations or your experiences if the grief is not properly handled?
Yeah.
What does that manifest into for
Yeah.
the individual?
Yeah, I have seen it in so many adult MKs in their 40s and 50s even. I was at Moody a few years back at their missions conference, and I had a book table and I was speaking on MKs, and a man walked in off the street. He saw the signs for missions conference, and it turns out he was an MK. He was in his 50s. He had a wife and children. He owned his own business. I picture him in a beautiful suburban house with a picket fence and the Labrador Retriever or whatever. So he had, in every way imaginable, he had established himself as belonging in the United States. And just as he was turning around to leave, I asked him, so how do you still feel your MK-ness today? And his eyes immediately filled up with tears. This man who by most standards has everything, his eyes filled up with tears, and he said, I still don't feel like I belong anywhere. And that lack of belonging is how grief manifests a lot of times. And it's something that we will carry with us into the future if we don't address it when it is current in our lives. I have met, again, people in their 60s and 70s who have lived full, beautiful lives in a monocultural setting, and who still, when they hear a sound from their previous lives or see an image flash across their screen, they're taken back there to the grief that is still lingering under this lid that they have screwed on so tightly. So the problem with grief that isn't addressed is long-term sadness that can be depression, that can be anxiety as well. It can also morph into resentment, a resentment of the place that you don't want to be because you're still carrying the grief of the places that you have left. So a resentment, which was me in college, a resentment of, for me, the American culture, the American people. I didn't realize how differently Americans enter into relationships. Had I known that, this is why it's one of the main topics I speak on as well. Had I known the difference in relationship building methods between MKs, who are so intense and so rapid, and North Americans, who are so gradual. We're talking not maybe even weeks and months, we're talking maybe years to get to the level that we reach as MKs within a couple of days with each other. If I had known that, the grief that I was carrying from the goodbyes I had to say when I left my foreign home would have been somewhat healed by knowing that I was actually building into relationships that were going to be important to me down the road. But I felt like I kept butting up against this wall of talking about sports and movies and music and cafeteria food, and felt like these relationships weren't going anywhere, which added to my resentment and my grief. Had I known that those seemingly shallow conversations were actually the building blocks to a deeper relationship down the road, I would have evaluated them completely differently. But with grief, our capacity to evaluate and see nuance is weakened in a big way.
Gotcha. So grief is pretty much, you say it manifests itself with depression. It also can manifest itself with kind of how you behave around people. You're kind of quick to write people off.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my gosh, like this is such a shallow conversation. Like, nah, like this is not worth my time. I'm looking for someone that I can like share my life with. I'm looking
Yes.
for like that depth. Right?
Yes.
So pretty much what you're saying is with what can happen with grief or sadness is we kind of put on like a ton of lens where we're not looking at the big picture. We're kind of like a narrow-minded perspective. And if that's not addressed, we can end up missing out on kind of those deep connections, that sense of community that is necessary in order to, again, establish your identity, establish those skills, correct?
And there's also a flip side to that. So the flip side is the MK who so desperately needs relationship because we've lost so many, who is going to enter a culture like this one where I'm sitting now, and use MK style relationship building techniques, which is we meet somebody and to make sure that they're our kind of person and to make sure that they're going to be worth the heartbreak of saying goodbye to them someday. We dive deep really fast. We tell them everything about ourselves as kind of a test. Are you my kind of people? And then we know who they are, right? So when we do that to somebody who's North American and used to the very gradual descent into something that becomes meaningful relationship, when we approach them with this test that we've used all our lives naturally with fellow MKs, they think we are so freakish that they don't know what to do with us, or we miscommunicate the degree to which we are in friendship with them. One example, I was at snow camp a few years ago, and that's a camp that happens in January for a lot of Midwestern college MKs to come to in Michigan. And I was doing a talk about relationships, and I think it was snow camp. It might not have been, don't quote me on that. But somebody said, this guy over here needs to tell you about his relationship building faux pas. And this guy had been engaging in MK style relationships because he so desperately needed connection at the beginning of his college career. And he was going really deep, really fast with girls. And again, in the MK community, this is normal, telling them about his spiritual struggles and, his, I don't know, health issues, parents' marriage, whatever it was. He was just being very open and vulnerable with these girls that he was meeting for coffee or for study dates or whatever. And he discovered, I think it was his junior year, at the end of his junior year, that there were two girls on campus who were fully expecting him to propose to them, because in a monocultural setting, verbal intimacy is relational intimacy. In the MK world, that's just friendship. So that's the flip side, is that when we enter too fast in our way into relationships to try and relieve some of our loneliness and sadness, we can kind of make mistakes that have ripple effects on other people as well. So in the middle of all this grief and transition, we somehow need to manage all of this. And it's hard. And this is why this transition is probably the hardest of an MK's life, but it can be done well and beautifully. And grief can be healed, and relationships can be found, and community can be built if we just know enough to know what we're looking at.
So I want to build on to that. So you talk about the idea of having proper conversation etiquette. We're really understanding the conversation dynamics, especially compared to, conversation that happens over here in the States versus that happens over as an MK.
Yeah.
So we all understand that community is one of the most important things that MK really needs when they transition, having a good, solid community where people can support them, they're known, they're understood. So I guess the question is, how exactly can this TCK, MK that are coming back, how can we have those, what are the common skills, what do we need to know in order to have these conversations to really build that community, to build those friendships, so it's not feeling like we're overwhelming them with like, it's too much, or where we're too scared to even try. Like, what are some ways we can do in order to like build those friendships?
It takes number one, awareness that those friendships, that those small conversations are building to something that we're looking for. So we look at those initial conversations as being shallow. I've heard that word so many times. These people are so shallow. It's what I expected when I moved back to the States. Everybody is so shallow. Those people look at us and think they're so intense. They're like freakishly intense, and I don't know what to do with them. So the skill that we need is patience and trust in the system, knowing that it's going to take a while to figure out even who these people are, and what are, I'm thinking in French, what are atomes crochus, are atoms that kind of hook onto each other are, what our affinities are. And so that's why there's this need to still stay in relationship with people that you have known that might be long distance for you right now. And at the same time, to be engaging in these conversations, revealing a little bit more of yourself. Not everybody is going to go at a snail's pace, even totally monocultural people. Not everybody is wired that way. So you will find the exception who wants to know more about you, and who wants to go deeper into communication. And that's great. But until that person turns up, keep investing in these slow, necessary relationship building conversations that to us feel useless, but in this different relational system, they're really helpful and useful. What was the other thing I was going to say? It was on the tip of my mind. Oh, it's gone. Sorry. It might come back to me. If it does, I'll mention it then.
Oh, that's good. I like that. It's really making sure you show that patience. That makes a lot of sense.
I remember what it was. If you are a raging introvert, as I am, I've learned skills, but I'm a raging introvert. I hid in my room the entirety, really, of my college career. I hid in my room. My encouragement to you is to be in a place where you are making yourself available. Some introverts are not going to be able to walk into a party and start talking to people. Totally understand that. That was me. But if you can at least put your butt in a chair at the party so that other people can see you and give them an opportunity to connect with you, to initiate with you, that's one step that even introverts like myself can take. And it might be 3 parties where nobody talks to you, but at least you're putting yourself in the dorm lounge or wherever it is, in the cafeteria, in the cafe, in a place where you can look up and make eye contact with people and allow them to initiate with you, even if you're not capable at that point of initiating with them.
That's so good. I think that's a really important thing, is making yourself available, because I've done it before where I just kind of like, oh my gosh, I got no connections, no friendships. But I'm like, I think about it, I'm like, I never actually went out or anything. I was like, didn't actually put myself out there, didn't actually give the opportunity to meet people, to talk. And sometimes I also know that sometimes when people go to these places, their body language, they're kind of closed off, like, oh, like be open, right?
Yes.
Be available. Like make people want to come up, talk, make that eye contact. I think that's important.
Make eye contact, yes.
People be like, not making eye contact, like open body language. That's great.
And some MKs come from cultures where eye contact is not good. So we need to relearn. We need to learn this culture. Again, like I said before, with all of our cultural skills, in the same way that if we were dumped into a tribe somewhere, we would observe what they do and try to figure out why they do it and how we can enter into their manner of things. We need to do the exact same thing with this culture that's supposed to be home and familiar to us. We need to approach it like a scientist would and figure out how it is that it functions, why it functions that way, and how to enter into it. One more trick, if I might. Is it okay for me to add one more thing? One of the frustrating things for MKs is when you're asked, where are you from, which will come in every conversation of meeting new people. And a lot of times MKs feel like, oh, this is my chance. Let me tell you everything. So my dad's Canadian, my mom's American. I was born in France. I went to a school in Germany, try to fit all of that in. And then the person goes, oh, and walks away. Or somebody will go, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more. So my encouragement to how to answer, where are you from, is multiple. Number one, be truthful. So start with a general answer that is truthful, because we don't want to put all of these aspects of our lives that are important and precious to us. We don't want to put them out there until we know that that person is able to receive them. So if somebody asks me, where are you from? Even today, I'll say, well, I was born and raised in Europe, but I live in Wheaton now. And if that's where it ends and they walk away, we've not revealed a whole lot about what we hold dear to us. If they say, oh, we're in Europe, I'll say, well, France and then Germany. And if that's where it ends, still okay. If they say, oh, we're in Germany. So waiting for them to ask further questions. And a lot of people will not, because again, that slow line of getting to know people, asking them about purposes and experiences might not be at the top of that line yet, but some will. So if we start general, are honest, and give them the extra information as they request it, we won't find ourselves in this position, which I did so many times, of having laid it all out on the table for a stranger and then realize that they couldn't care less about what my life or whatever was. So that's just a trick that's helpful in transition.
It's a very good trick because that's a common question. Like, oh, how do I respond to that? Where are you from? Oh, I like that.
How much time do you have? Right? Where are you from? Well, I've got the 5-minute version and the 20-minute version.
Quickness, sparkness for you.
That's right.
Michelle, we're starting to hit that 10-minute mark, but we're going to go ahead and we're just going to see into some questions that the chat has, and then see your thoughts on it. So one question that we got was, in your experience, what is the most common reason that MKs have a negative concept of their passport country?
A really good question. There are multiple reasons for it. One is if it's American, and I'm sorry if you're Canadian, you get lumped in with Americans by other cultures. If you're overseas in a place where there's news coverage of the United States, a lot of times it is negative. The news coverage you see about your passport culture is negative. We also sometimes feel like the reputation of our passport culture is on our shoulders. And when that reputation is bad, we don't want anything to do with it. A lot of times it's in our social circles when, like I said earlier, when our national sport is making fun of our passport culture. All Americans are that kind of a sentence that we keep adding insults to, so kind of feeding it. A lot of times it's our own parents who, maybe in order to make it easier for them to be separated from their home culture, are finding the flaws in it and not necessarily speaking of the good things in it. Or we highlight the people who are obnoxious on furlough. Even in families, we sometimes highlight the difficult people, and we don't say, but look at these amazing people who are also part of our lives. And I think there's almost an arrogance that develops in us. It's often perceived as arrogance, but in my experience, it often is arrogance, where we just assume that these people have nothing to give us. We've seen so much more, we've experienced so much more, we speak more languages than they do, and that is so, it's shooting ourselves in the foot if we allow that arrogance to take hold in our minds and in our relational ability, because as we've been talking about, it's going to take a while to figure out who these people really are, but there's beauty and goodness and connection and community to be found with people who have no idea what river runs through Paris. And that's okay, because they have other things in their lives that are beautiful and worthy, in spite of the fact that they weren't raised like we were.
Oh, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like by process of kind of what the parents are like. When you go back, just make sure you're careful, because they do this in America. They do a lot of, for example, you do a lot of partying, a lot of stuff. You want to avoid that. You want to be careful. Yeah. Americans are super independent. They're like kind of like stuff by omission that, for example, in place of a warning, it can come as a negative concept, a negative experience, or a negative thought about it. Like, oh my gosh, they're so secular.
Yeah, and it builds fear. It builds fear, right? Yeah.
Great. So I guess I want to end up with this before we wrap it up. So let's say you're in college, you're your junior year, you transition, you're a couple of years in. What is one piece of advice? So this junior in college is feeling still lonely. He's feeling like an imposter. He's trying what they call fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
He's gonna try to put himself out there, but the results aren't really good. He or she is starting to feel that, maybe no one just likes him. Maybe there's something wrong with him. What is one piece of advice you can give this TCK that?
Yeah, I have one positive piece and one, it's not negative, but one reality piece. There are so many more options today for connecting with people than there used to be. And it might require that we do something that we've kind of looked down on in the past, but meetup groups that you can find on the internet. Be safe, make sure that you know what you're getting into, go with a friend, whatever, but people who meet up around like love of bowling or love of knitting or love of puppies. There are these groups that you can find. If there isn't anybody in your immediate entourage, you can go beyond that and look for people with common interests online and join those groups. Join any kind of team activity that will give you more options of people that you're meeting. Ask friends to introduce you to friends, or if you have older people in your life who know other people your age, ask them to introduce you. Put yourself on the line by going to social things you don't want to go to. whether they be church activities or events. Just give yourself as many opportunities as you can. But here's the caveat. We can't manufacture the kind of relationship we're looking for. Either the vibes are there or the vibes aren't there, right? So we might go down that slow line 10 times and figure out that that person is a good friend, but not the kindred spirit that we're looking for. And I really encourage MKs who are in that position to value the friends they've got, the more, I'm not going to say shallow, but the less marrow deep friendships that they have, because those are what tide you over until you find the real friendships you're looking for. All these other friendships are wonderful and meaningful and a gift from God. And they have given me the social circle I needed and the opportunity to leave my house and see things and do things and learn things. So important, all of those friendships. The kindred spirit might be rarer, and it's worth waiting and investing in those other friendships until that kindred spirit turns up.
One more quick question. Someone said, what should a monocultural person do when they are transitioning to the US?
A monocultural person?
Correct.
Yeah. Look at it as if, seriously, apply every skill you've got in your toolbox that you would apply to moving to a remote village where there's no electricity, no cars, no nothing. You would do your research in advance. You would use our great skills at understanding cultures. You would do all of that in advance of moving even. And then when you get to this place as a monocultural, moving to another monocultural situation, use those skills to figure out what makes this culture tick, and not looking for, this is the easy thing, is to look at what drives us crazy. The easy thing is to look for the failures and the flaws of a new culture. Look for reasons to celebrate this culture. And there are many, and they're not necessarily just the exceptions. Sometimes those reasons are so obvious that we miss them. The friendliness of the American population to me is something I had to flip a switch on, because initially I thought they're all so shallow. Why are they calling me by my first name when they read my credit card? What is wrong with these people? They are honoring me with a high social value of friendliness. And I totally misread it for all those years because I wasn't aware of what this culture was made of and what makes it tick. So use those abilities, those analytical abilities, to step back and observe while taking small steps into the culture as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Before we close, I just want to pretty much sum up everything that we said. So pretty much as we're transitioning, it's really important that we do preparation, that parents are really being involved with kind of areas, helping them transition almost before you pass baton. Make sure that's set. Make sure they got a good community, making sure that as much as possible, kind of make it the transition as seamless as possible by being there. If you can, plan ahead. A couple of things we also discussed was really address the grief, especially when you place. Don't bottle it up. Address it, process it, because the grief is not processed, can manifest itself as intense loneliness, intense sadness. Those are some of the aspects. And pretty much important part of transitioning is get a good community. And that involves putting yourself out there, involves taking risks, involves making yourself available, being patient though, not being too overwhelming, but being patient, making sure that you're actually taking your time, you're investing with people, and not just selling them off short. I love that. Now, before we go, Michelle, can you plug in, like, where can they find you? What are some resources you got? What's your website? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, my website is michellephoenix.com. So that's Michelle with one L, Michele. Phoenix is Ophoenix. Everything is on that website. My blog has the more chronological articles, and then there's one tab that says MK articles, and they're organized by topic. I wrote some of them down. Topics like relationships, faith, belonging, abuse, spiritual warfare, grief and loss, mental health, sexuality, complex identity, and transition. That's all there. And the most read articles from there are also, as I mentioned before, on my podcast, Pondering Purple. The podcast is just an audio version of those articles, and again, it's available on all of the podcast platforms out there.
Nice. So, you guys heard that? Find her, search her up, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all that. Ronnie, is there any other resources that you also have that was not mentioned? But it seems like Michelle has a lot too. So,
I'm going to stick with that one. Well, again, I mean, as far, Michelle is a great resource. Interaction International, again, is also a good resource. They have the TCK Connect .org. They have those TCK chats and just go to their website and you'll find a lot of resources to go ahead, Michelle.
Can I also add MUCAPA? A lot of campuses
Right.
have a chapter of MUCAPA, and that can be a really good connecting group, even if it's one of those interim until I can spread out into the broader community. MUCAPA is going to be my people.
Right. Oh, MUCAPA, actually, Tammy had asked me to plug this in. Thank you for reminding me.
Tammy's a friend.
Right.
I'm doing her work.
We love her. We love her.
Yeah.
Okay. So with Tammy, also with MUCAPA, they are doing a lot of things right now. They have some books that they're going to do some small groups. So I'm just going to just say, go to their website. And I think there's transition workbooks that they're going to start doing regionally also, right? Online regionally. So just want to plug that in. Go to their website and you will see a lot of resources there. What else? What else is there? And you're going to see Michelle next month. February. I'm sorry. In February. Sorry, it's been a long day. My brain is already turning into mush. But I'm having fun. This is great. So it's going to be February 18th to the 20th. We're going to be in Georgia. We're going to have a blast. And guess who's going to be there too, Michelle? Brett Taylor.
Oh, excellent.
And Tammy. Yes,
we've got
this
the
is
trifecta.
right. This is going to be a blast. So, so if you are an MK in college or post college, go to Compass's website and register. Do it now, right away. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Chandler did a great job. I think I'm just going to retire and you can take over. So don't forget, thank you so much, Michelle. And we'll talk soon.
Yeah.
Okay. So don't forget, for those of you who are still online, stay online, because the next segment, our last segment, is all about the Root House. So we are going to transport. I'm staying here, but the girls are at their house right now. They're going to give you a tour of their house. They're going to talk about their adjustments, and they're going to talk about the program. And if you're interested in this transition house, stay tuned. In about 15 minutes, we will be with them. Again, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Chandler. We'll see you soon.
Hi, everybody.
All right, everybody.